My name is Ellie Whitman. I'm 65 years old, and I've spent most of my life keeping the peace, smoothing over family friction, and putting everyone else first. But as I stepped into the warmly lit dining room of our Madison suburban home that Christmas evening, I realized some things can't be smoothed over. The scent of roasted turkey mingled with pine from the tree, the clinking of glasses punctuating polite conversation, but beneath it all, I felt the familiar tension tightening in my chest. Daniel, my son, 39 now, sat at the head of the table, his posture rigid, eyes sharp and assessing. Across the room, my sister Margaret smiled politely, though her expression didn't reach her eyes. I offered greetings, placed my coat on the rack, and tried to settle into the motions of the holiday ritual. But the air was heavy with something unsaid. Then Daniel leaned forward, his voice cutting through the chatter with an icy clarity. In our eyes, you're already dead. The words landed like a hammer. The room fell silent. Forks paused midair. Relatives froze in place. And I could feel every eye flicking to me, waiting for my reaction. My chest tightened, a surge of disbelief mixing with a pang of hurt that went deeper than any scolding or criticism from the past. For a moment, I wanted to recoil, to shrink back into the wall and let the words define me. But somewhere deep inside, a spark of resolve ignited. I forced myself to breathe, to steady my shaking hands, and to meet Daniel's gaze without flinching. The silence stretched long enough to feel infinite, and in that suspended moment, I remembered every lesson, every sacrifice, every year I had devoted to this family. This wasn't just another critique or another comparison. It was a declaration, and it would mark the beginning of something that couldn't be ignored. I can still remember the sharp scent of polished wood and lemon cleaner in my childhood home, a scent that always seemed to accompany my mother's watchful gaze. My name is Eleanor, though everyone called me Ellie even then, and at 7 years old, I already understood the unspoken rules of our house. Perfection was mandatory, obedience unquestioned, and any misstep would be magnified. My mother, Donna, ruled our home with meticulous precision. She measured every action, every word, against an invisible standard I could never quite reach. My sister, Margaret, was the favorite, the one whose grades were always pinned to the fridge, whose piano recitals earned applause and praise, whose every achievement seemed to eclipse my own existence. I tried to match her, tried to earn even a fraction of the approval she effortlessly received. But my small successes were shrugged off, deemed insufficient or inconsequential. My father, David, rarely spoke, but his nods and silent compliance reinforced my mother's exacting demands. If I hesitated, he would mutter, "Listen to your mother," and retreat to his newspaper, leaving me alone to navigate the invisible minefield of expectations. Friendships were monitored, hobbies scrutinized, and choices I thought mine were always filtered through my mother's lens of refinement. At school, I learned to hide. I whispered to friends only when I knew my mother wasn't listening. I swallowed my frustration when Margaret teased me over mistakes I couldn't help. I learned that compliance kept the storms at bay, that silence was safer than speaking up. Each reprimand, each glance of disappointment, carved into me a sense of inadequacy that I carried like a shadow well into adulthood. Even as I tried to shine in small ways, a writing contest, a neat science project, my victories were always measured against Margaret's brilliance. My accomplishments felt muted, as if the world itself had trained me to shrink. It was a life of constant comparison, of learning early that my worth was conditional and invisible unless it mirrored someone else's. Those lessons followed me into every room of my adult life, every decision, every relationship. The shadows of childhood lingered, shaping my choices long before Daniel uttered those words across the Christmas table. By the time I was in my 40s, I had learned to pour every ounce of myself into raising Daniel, often at the expense of my own desires. I worked long hours as an administrative assistant, picking up extra shifts when the bills piled up, and spent weekends ferrying him to soccer games, piano lessons, and tutoring sessions. I barely had the energy to endure. Every decision seemed dictated by his needs, his happiness, his future, leaving little room for mine. Daniel, in those years, depended on me in ways I couldn't deny. He leaned on my guidance for school choices, friendships, even the smallest personal decisions. Each time he asked for help, my instinct was to step forward, to shield him from mistakes I had learned the hard way. And though I loved him fiercely, that love came with an invisible weight, the constant awareness that my own ambitions were quietly deferred. Small moments of resentment crept in, though I rarely let them show. I remember one evening, after a particularly grueling week, sitting at the kitchen table while Daniel happily recounted his plans for college. I forced a smile, nodding along, while a pang of longing tugged at me for the career I had once dreamed of pursuing, for the freedom I had imagined. But I swallowed the feeling, reminding myself that his success and comfort were paramount. I became practiced at quiet endurance, at celebrating his achievements while muting my own. My personal projects, a painting class I had once loved, the small book I'd tried to write, were shelved, tucked away as private reminders of who I might have been. The years of giving shaped me, taught me patience, discipline, and resilience. But they also built a quiet yearning beneath the surface, a yearning that, years later, would demand acknowledgement when the family I had devoted myself to finally challenged my independence. Retirement arrived quietly, like the first snow of winter, soft, inevitable, and full of possibility. My days were suddenly my own. The long hours I once spent answering phones, filing paperwork, and ferrying Daniel to endless commitments were gone. I found myself lingering over breakfast at a small cafe downtown, savoring coffee without checking a schedule, listening to the hum of Madison's streets instead of the constant buzz of obligations. I reconnected with old friends, joined a community art class I had abandoned decades ago, and volunteered at the local library. Each small, choice painting in pastels, reading to children on Saturday mornings, walking through Olbrich Botanical Gardens reminded me that life could be measured in more than responsibilities. A quiet excitement built within me, subtle but persistent, like a spark ready to ignite. It was in one of those bright, chilly mornings at the garden that I met Michael. He was arranging a display of winter blooms with the same careful attention I had once reserved for my own work. He looked up as I approached, his gray hair catching the sunlight, and offered a warm, unassuming smile. "It's tricky to get these plants to thrive this time of year," he said. His voice was calm, grounded. I laughed, and for the first time in years, conversation flowed easily, without judgment or expectation. Over the following weeks, we met for walks along Lake Monona and quiet lunches at the cafe. Michael had a steady patience, an appreciation for small joys, and a gentle humor that made me feel seen, not as someone defined by past sacrifices, but as a person capable of growth and happiness. For the first time, I sensed the life I had imagined, one outside the confines of my family's control. In Michael's presence, I rediscovered curiosity, confidence, and a quiet excitement for possibilities. The walls built from decades of duty and self-suppression began to crumble, leaving space for laughter, conversation, and choices that belonged solely to me. That winter, I realized independence wasn't just freedom from responsibility. It was freedom to claim my own joy. With retirement settled into a steady rhythm, I began building a life that belonged entirely to me. I opened a small savings account in my own name, one that Daniel and the rest of the family didn't know existed, and quietly set aside funds each month. A modest investment in a local credit union promised returns that, while not extravagant, symbolized control over my own future. It was a small rebellion, a way to prove to myself that I could secure independence even after decades of putting everyone else first. Beyond finances, I embraced the hobbies and social circles I had long postponed. The art class I rejoined flourished into a community of like-minded peers. We exchanged critiques, ideas, and laughter. I volunteered at the library every Saturday, reading stories to children whose curiosity reminded me of the spark I'd once had. I even started a small gardening club with Michael, tending plots of winter kale and herbs along Lake Monona. Every interaction, every quiet success, was a reminder that my life could be measured in moments of joy rather than obligations. All the while, my family remained blissfully unaware of the life I had quietly nurtured. Daniel assumed I spent my free time catching up on chores or errands. My social life minimal. Margaret occasionally called, asking how I was spending my time, never imagining that my days were full of laughter, learning, and fulfillment. I allowed their assumptions to persist, smiling privately at the irony. It was exhilarating to hold a secret that bolstered my confidence and reminded me that control could exist in subtle forms. I moved through the days with a quiet sense of purpose, savoring the knowledge that I had created a space where my choices mattered. I could plan my weekends without interference, explore new ideas without judgment, and simply exist without needing approval. Each morning, I woke feeling lighter, more grounded, and more certain that the coming holiday would test the boundaries I had carefully built, but also affirm the strength I had discovered. Even as I prepared meals and sent greetings to the family that still thought me dependent, I reveled in my hidden victories. I had carved out a life of autonomy, and the tension of knowing they would eventually encounter it only heightened the satisfaction. The sense of anticipation was quiet but electric, a promise that the world I had constructed in shadows was ready to step into the light. The late afternoon sun slanted through my living room windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. When the doorbell rang insistently, without pause, I set down my tea, a quiet unease rising in my chest. It wasn't usual for anyone to drop by unannounced, especially not Daniel. My mind raced as I moved toward the door, each step measured, each breath steady. I opened it to find him there, flanked by Margaret and two cousins I barely knew. Daniel's face was taut, his jaw tight, eyes flashing with a mix of frustration and desperation. "Mom," he began, his voice low and urgent. "We need to talk. You can't just shut us out like this." I let him speak, letting the words wash over me. He tried to manipulate, to guilt me, reminding me of years of responsibility, of the sacrifices I had made for him. Margaret chimed in with a softer tone, pleading for understanding, her words laced with subtle pressure. The cousins looked on nervously, uncertain how to intervene. The familiar patterns were all there, the guilt, the judgment, the insistence that my choices were somehow wrong. But I felt nothing like the old fear. Instead, a quiet clarity settled over me. I remembered the years of compliance, the moments I had swallowed resentment, the decades spent bending to their will. And yet here I stood, a life fully my own, cultivated in silence, resilient and unshakable. Daniel's desperation escalated, his tone sharper, almost pleading. "Ellie, you don't understand. We're worried. We care about the family, about what's going to happen to you." I met his gaze evenly, recognizing the echoes of my mother's voice in his words. They expected me to shrink, to comply, to let their expectations dictate my actions. Instead, I inhaled slowly and let the quiet power of my life and choices radiate through my posture, through the calm in my voice. I didn't need to argue, to justify, to beg for recognition. They could see the truth in the way I held myself. This confrontation wasn't a battle I needed to fight. They had arrived, and I was ready. I stepped back slightly, inviting them in without a word, letting the tension hang in the air. Every second stretched, heavy with anticipation. The stage was set. They had come to test me, to reclaim the control they had always assumed was theirs. But I knew something they didn't this time. I would not yield. The room felt smaller somehow, the air thick with anticipation and unspoken accusations as Daniel and the others stepped inside. Margaret hovered near the doorway, her eyes darting between Daniel and me, while my cousins lingered awkwardly behind, uncertain whether to intervene. I could feel the weight of every past expectation pressing down, every lesson learned in silence, every sacrifice I had carried for decades. Daniel's voice trembled, but his words were sharp. "Mom, you can't just ignore us. You've built this life apart from us. It's not right." He gestured vaguely toward the space around me. The books, the art, the small garden Michael and I had nurtured. We raised you to respect family, to value tradition. This is betrayal. Margaret stepped forward, softer but no less insistent. "Ellie, we just want to understand. Don't you see how much you're hurting us?" Her tone was layered with guilt, the kind that had shaped me since childhood, the same voice that had made me doubt myself for years. I let them speak, but I did not falter. I felt the echo of my mother's critiques, my father's silent nods, the relentless comparisons to Margaret as a child. I saw it all laid bare, every moment I had tried to please, every effort dismissed, every joy minimized, and for the first time, I did not shrink. I inhaled slowly, letting the tension build and then fall away in one steady exhale. "I have listened to you, and I have heard your fears, your disappointment, your judgment," I said, my voice calm but firm. "But the life I have built is mine, the choices I make, the happiness I cultivate, they are not yours to control." Daniel opened his mouth to argue, but I raised a hand, stopping him without anger. "I do not owe you obedience, nor do I owe you approval. I have spent a lifetime bending to expectations that were never mine. I am done." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. The cousins exchanged uneasy glances, and Daniel's hands twitched at his sides. Silence stretched across the room, heavy and absolute. Then I delivered the words that had formed in my mind for decades, the culmination of every lesson learned and every boundary ignored in the past. "The dead cannot come back." The phrase hung in the air, crystalline and final. Eyes widened, mouths opened and closed, no words finding their way out. Shock rippled through the room as the weight of my autonomy settled over us all. I did not step back. I did not waver. For the first time, the power I had quietly nurtured was visible, undeniable. And in that moment, I understood fully this confrontation was not about anger or punishment or revenge. It was about self-respect, about claiming the life I had earned and refusing to allow anyone, child, sibling, or parent, to diminish it ever again. After the door closed behind Daniel and the others, a quiet settled over the apartment, warm and deliberate, like sunlight spilling across the hardwood floor. I sank into the armchair by the window, taking in the view of the snow-dusted streets of Madison, the tension that had haunted me for decades, the pressure, the judgment. The constant need to justify every choice had finally lifted. For the first time in my life, I felt fully present in my own world. Michael placed a steaming cup of tea beside me, his hand brushing mine with a gentle familiarity. "You're okay," he said, but I didn't need his reassurance. I was okay. I had survived their expectations, their attempts to control me, and I had emerged whole, stronger, and unshakable. The days that followed were filled with small, deliberate joys. I returned to the art studio, working on a series of pastel landscapes that reflected the quiet strength I had discovered in myself. I hosted friends for brunches, sharing laughter and conversation without restraint. Weekends were spent volunteering, walking along the lake with Michael, tending our small winter garden, and exploring corners of the city I had once passed by in a blur of obligation. Every action reinforced the life I had chosen, the autonomy I had fought for. I occasionally thought of my family, their struggles, their ignorance of the life I had quietly nurtured. It was not malice that kept them from understanding me. It was the lens of expectation they had always applied, and that realization no longer troubled me. Their disapproval could not reach the space I had claimed for myself. Each night, as the city lights flickered outside our windows and the warmth of the apartment settled around us, I reflected on the lessons I had learned. Independence is not merely the absence of control. It is the presence of choice, the freedom to cultivate joy, to surround yourself with those who see your worth, and to honor your own needs without guilt. With Michael by my side, a network of friends who had become chosen family, and the simple rhythms of a life wholly my own, I had reclaimed something I had long been denied: peace. And in that peace, I discovered the most profound lesson of all: happiness is not granted by approval. It is claimed by those brave enough to take it. Years later, I still marvel at how different life feels when you finally claim it for yourself. My mornings begin with sunlight spilling across the apartment, a cup of coffee in hand, and the quiet satisfaction of projects I've nurtured on my own terms. The art studio thrives, and small exhibitions in Madison showcase the landscapes and portraits I once tucked away, hesitant to pursue. Michael and I continue our walks along Lake Monona, laughter and conversation filling the spaces that once felt heavy with obligation. The family, of course, remains on the periphery. Daniel and Margaret have adjusted in their own ways, but their choices, their judgments, no longer reach me. I allow myself a private acknowledgement of their struggles, tempered by the clarity that their lives are no longer mine to navigate or fix. Boundaries, once a distant concept, are now concrete. I answer only when I choose, speak only when I wish, and live in a space where respect is mutual and joy intentional. Each day reinforces the lesson I fought so long to learn. My value is not measured by approval, and peace is found in self-respect, not in compliance. In this life I've built, there is room for love, for creativity, for quiet reflection, and for the unwavering knowledge that I am finally free to be wholly, unapologetically myself.